They whispered his name in fear. Then she realized the human was standing beside her. The screaming had not stopped in 3 days. I stood at the edge of the refugee processing tent, listening to sounds that no translator implant could soften. Bodies pressed against each other, shaking, covered in dust that used to be a border colony. I was Vex, an intelligence officer of the Krillian Assembly, and I had seen collapsed outposts before. I had seen fear before, but I had never seen anything like this. A young Dravith soldier sat on a crate near the entrance, his 4 eyes wide and unfocused, his hands trembling around a cup of water he was not drinking. I knelt beside him, keeping my voice low and steady, the way we are trained to speak to survivors. "Soldier," I said, "can you tell me what happened at the outpost?" He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he had not heard the question. Then his lips moved, barely above a whisper. "Harlan." That was all. One word. No rank, no unit designation, no coordinates. Just a name, spoken the way you might speak of something you were not sure had finished happening yet. I had heard that name twice already that morning, from 2 different survivors who did not know each other and came from 2 different collapsed positions on the frontier. I told myself it was coincidence. Panic breeds rumors, and rumors need names to hold on to. But something about the way the soldier said it made the back of my neck feel cold. "Who is Harlan?" I asked. The soldier's cup slipped from his fingers and hit the ground, spilling water across the dirt floor. He did not reach for it. He simply stared past me, toward the tent flap, as if expecting someone to walk through it. "He does not stop," the soldier said. "That is all I know. He does not stop." I straightened up and walked outside, into air thick with dust and distant smoke. Around me, the camp stretched in every direction, a temporary city of tents and broken transports and people who had lost everything in less than a single rotation of this planet. I had been sent here to gather intelligence on the enemy that had taken the outpost, a coalition force we believed to be led by seasoned officers from at least 3 allied species. Nowhere in my briefing had there been mention of a name like Harlan. I found my superior, Commander Athos, near the command vehicle, reviewing data slates with 2 other officers. Athos was old for our species, his scales dulled with age, but his mind remained sharp enough that the assembly kept extending his service well past the normal term. "Commander," I said, "I need to ask you something." He did not look up from the slate. "You have the look of someone who found a problem instead of an answer. The survivors keep repeating a name, Harlan, no title, no unit. Just the name, and it terrifies them more than anything else about what happened." Athos paused. His clawed fingers stopped moving across the slate's surface. That pause told me more than any answer could have. "You know the name," I said. "I know a rumor," he replied carefully. "There have been reports along 3 separate points of the frontier. Outposts that should have held for weeks falling in hours. Survivors who cannot explain how it happened, only that a single figure was at the center of it every time." "A single figure," I repeated. "One person did this?" "That is what the reports suggest. I do not believe it myself. No single soldier ends a siege alone, no matter what species they belong to. It is far more likely that Harlan is a designation for a small strike unit, and the survivors, in their trauma, are collapsing many soldiers into one name." It was a reasonable explanation. It was the kind of explanation the assembly liked, because it kept the universe predictable. Strength came from numbers, discipline, coordinated firepower. No army had ever been broken by one person, and no army ever would be. That was the foundation the entire military doctrine of 100 species rested on. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way the young soldier's hands had shaken stayed with me the rest of that day. That evening, I requested access to the sensor archive recovered from the fallen outpost. Most of the recording arrays had been destroyed, but a handful of automated defense turrets had survived long enough to capture partial footage before they were disabled. I sat alone in a cramped analysis pod, feeding the corrupted files into the display, expecting static and burned circuitry, and very little else. The first several minutes showed exactly what I expected. Chaos. Weapons fire lighting up the dark. Soldiers moving in and out of frame, some falling, most running for cover. It was the ordinary, terrible shape of a battle collapsing. Then, at the 11-minute mark, the feed steadied on a section of open ground between 2 collapsed barricades. A single figure walked into frame. He was not running. He was not crouched or moving in the careful, practiced patterns our combat doctrine drilled into every soldier from basic training onward. He walked, upright, at an ordinary pace, the way a person might walk across a courtyard on a quiet afternoon, Weapons fire streaked past him from both directions. I watched the recording twice, then a third time, certain I was witnessing a glitch in the corrupted file, some visual artifact from the damaged sensor. But the timestamp was consistent. The other elements in the frame moved normally. Only he seemed to exist outside the panic around him. I could not make out his face clearly. The resolution was poor, and smoke drifted across the frame at odd intervals. But I could see enough to know he was human. Average height. Nothing about his build suggested unusual strength or augmentation. He wore no visible armor beyond a simple tactical vest, the kind worn by human logistics officers rather than frontline soldiers. Around him, trained warriors from 3 species broke formation and ran. I sat back from the display, my hands unsteady in a way I did not like. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps the footage had been altered. Perhaps this was a decoy, a piece of misinformation designed to demoralize us before the true assault came. I began drafting theories in my notes, each one more elaborate than the last, because the plain image in front of me refused to fit into any framework I understood. A soldier does not walk through crossfire and remain untouched. An army does not break because of one person standing still in the open. These were not things that happened. They were not things that could happen, according to every doctrine I had ever studied, every tactical simulation I had ever run, every lesson drilled into me since my first year of service. And yet the recording did not lie. I flagged the file for further analysis and sent a formal request to expand my investigation beyond the outpost, into the wider pattern of frontier collapses connected to the name. Athis approved it with visible reluctance, warning me not to waste resources chasing ghosts conjured by frightened refugees. He believed, as most of the assembly did, that humanity was a minor species, recently contacted, valued mostly for its willingness to negotiate, rather than for any military capability. Our analysts had classified them as soft, cooperative, unlikely to pose a serious threat to anyone. I closed the file that night with a question sitting heavy in my chest, one I could not yet answer and was not sure I wanted to. If the humans were as harmless as everyone believed, then who was the man standing calmly in the middle of a battle that should have ended his life within seconds, and why did every soldier who survived that battle refuse to say his name above a whisper? I did not sleep well. I kept seeing that figure on the display, walking forward while the world around him came apart, moving as though he already knew, with complete certainty, exactly how the moment would end. The next morning, a new set of reports arrived from a second collapsed position, more than 1,000 kilometers from the first. Different terrain, different defending force, different attacking coalition entirely, as far as our records showed. But buried in the survivor debriefs, repeated in 3 separate statements taken independently of one another, was the same word: Harlan. I stared at the reports for a long time before I finally understood that whatever I was looking for, it was not going to fit inside the explanation the assembly wanted. Something had changed on the frontier, something none of our doctrines had prepared us to recognize, and I had just become the person responsible for finding out what it was. I gathered my notes, requested transport clearance, and began preparing for the one assignment I never expected to receive. I was going to the refugee camps myself, to sit across from survivors and ask them, one at a time, to tell me exactly what they saw. Whatever the truth was, I intended to find it, even if every instinct I had was quietly warning me that I might not like what I found. The camp stretched further than I expected, rows of tents built from salvaged material, families sitting in silence outside shelters that were never meant to be permanent. I had reviewed hundreds of debrief transcripts in my career, and I thought I understood what fear looked like after a battle. I was wrong. This was something quieter, something that sat under the skin rather than on the surface. I began my interviews with a Dravith medic named Alira, who had treated the wounded during the final hours of the outpost's defense. She was calm at first, professional, describing supply shortages and triage decisions with the practiced detachment of someone who had done this work many times before. Then I asked her about the name. Her hands, which had been steady through every other question, stopped moving. "You want to know about Harlan," she said, not quite a question. "I want to understand what happened." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at a point somewhere past my shoulder. I did not see him myself, not directly. I was in the medical shelter behind the second line. But I heard the reports coming in over comms, and I saw what happened to the soldiers who came back. "What do you mean, what happened to them?" "They stopped fighting," she said. "Not because they were wounded, not because they ran out of ammunition. They simply stopped. In the middle of an engagement they were still capable of continuing, and they would not explain why. One of them, a lieutenant from the second company, kept repeating the same thing to me while I treated a wound on his arm. He said, over and over, that it did not matter what they did, that nothing they did was going to be enough, that the man was still coming. Still coming, I repeated. Those were his words. Not that the man was strong or fast or well armed, just that he was still coming, no matter what was done to stop him. I thanked her and moved to the next tent, and the next, and the pattern held with a consistency that unsettled me more than any single account could have on its own. Descriptions of the man himself varied wildly. Some said he was tall, others said he was of ordinary height. Some described armor plating that did not match anything in our records of human military equipment. Others insisted he wore nothing more than a simple field uniform. If I had been building a physical profile from these accounts alone, I would have concluded I was chasing several different individuals, not one. But the behavior around the name never varied. Every soldier who spoke it did so quietly, as though raising their voice might summon something they were not prepared to face again. Every civilian who overheard the word flinched, even those who had not witnessed the fighting directly, as if the fear itself had become contagious, spreading through the camp faster than any account of the actual events. I interviewed a young engineer named Corin, barely out of his training cycle, who had been stationed at a forward sensor post during the second collapse, more than 1,000 kilometers from the first. He had never met anyone from the first outpost. He had no way of coordinating a story with the survivors I had already spoken to, and yet his account, when it reached the moment where the name came up, matched theirs almost exactly. We had 3 days of supplies left, Corin told me. Command said we could hold for 2 weeks if needed. We had defensive positions layered 4 deep. I helped calibrate half of them myself. What changed? He walked through the first line like it wasn't there, Corin said, his voice dropping. Not around it, through it. I watched 2 of our best marksmen fire directly at him from less than 100 meters, and I watched him keep walking. I don't know how. I've replayed it in my head so many times I don't trust my own memory anymore. But it happened, and after that, nobody wanted to be the one standing between him and the rest of the base. I pressed him for tactical details, hoping to find some explanation grounded in equipment or technology, something that would let me file a report the assembly could act on. Advanced shielding, an experimental weapon, some kind of coordinated distraction that made a squad of soldiers appear as one man. Corin had no answers for me. He only had the memory, and the memory clearly still frightened him. It wasn't that he was unstoppable, Corin said finally, choosing his words with visible effort. I've heard stories about soldiers with heavy armor who shrug off fire. This wasn't that. It was like he had already decided the fight was over, and nothing that happened to him along the way was going to change that decision. That's the part I can't explain. That's the part that scares me more than the fighting did. I wrote his words down exactly as he spoke them, because I did not yet have a better way to describe what I was hearing across dozens of interviews. Not a weapon, not an army, a decision apparently, that refused to break under any pressure applied against it. By the 3rd day of interviews, I had built a strange kind of profile, one built almost entirely from psychological impact rather than physical description. I began to form a theory, tentative and difficult to defend, that the reason no 2 physical descriptions matched was not confusion or trauma distorting memory. It was that the descriptions did not matter to the people giving them. What mattered, what had burned itself into their memory instead, was the experience of watching someone continue forward when every rule of survival said he should have stopped. I brought my findings back to Commander Athis, expecting at least a measure of interest given the consistency of the pattern across unconnected engagements. Instead, I found him standing over a table of officers who were laughing quietly at something on a display screen. When I approached, Athis gestured for me to look. It was a recording, low resolution, showing a group of human soldiers unloading supply crates at a forward staging area. Ordinary, unremarkable footage. One of the officers pointed at the screen and made a comment about how slowly the humans worked, how disorganized their formation looked compared to standard Krillian logistics procedure. The group laughed again. You see the problem, Vex, Athis said, not unkindly. This is what humanity actually looks like. Slow, informal, cooperative to the point of weakness. Whatever happened at those outposts, it was not the work of soldiers like these. With respect, Commander, I have spoken to nearly 40 survivors across 2 separate engagements. They all describe the same behavior around the same name, despite having no contact with one another before or after the events. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern. It is trauma, Athis said. Soldiers under extreme stress often construct narratives that feel more coherent than the chaos they actually experienced. A single terrifying figure is easier for the mind to process than the truth. which is usually far messier and far less dramatic. I did not argue further, though I did not agree either. I had reviewed enough trauma debriefs to know what collective narrative distortion looked like, and this was not it. Distorted memories varied wildly in their details and their emotional register. What I was hearing had a strange, unsettling uniformity to it, as though every survivor had touched the same underlying truth, even if the surface details differed. That night, alone in my quarters, I reviewed the sensor footage from the first outpost again, frame by frame this time, searching for anything I might have missed. I paused on a moment near the end of the recording, just before the feed cut out entirely. The figure had turned, briefly, toward one of the surviving defensive positions. For less than a second, the smoke cleared enough that I could see the side of his face. He did not look like a monster. He did not look like a weapon. He looked tired, in the plain, ordinary way that any person looks tired after going too long without rest. There was no cruelty in his expression, no satisfaction, nothing that matched the dread his name inspired across an entire refugee population. That contradiction troubled me more than anything else I had gathered so far. Whatever Harlan was, the fear he inspired did not seem to come from anything visibly monstrous about him. It came from something else entirely, something I did not yet have language to describe. 3 days later, my formal request for reassignment came through, though not in the direction I expected. Rather than continuing my independent investigation, I was informed that I would be attached, as a junior analyst, to a joint diplomatic delegation, traveling to neutral ground to negotiate the contested frontier boundary, with representatives from several allied and rival species, humanity included. Athos delivered the news with the faint amusement of someone handing off a problem he no longer wanted to deal with personally. "Perhaps this will settle your curiosity," he said. "You will see for yourself how unremarkable these people are, up close, without the fog of battle to exaggerate them in your mind." I did not share his confidence, but I packed my equipment, reviewed the delegation roster one final time, and told myself that whatever I found at that summit, I would trust the evidence in front of me, rather than the comfortable assumptions everyone around me seemed determined to keep believing. I had no idea, as I boarded the transport that would carry me to the negotiating grounds, how close I was about to come to the very thing that had haunted every survivor I had interviewed. I only knew that something about this assignment felt different, and that feeling did not leave me for the entire journey. The negotiating hall stood on neutral ground, a converted trade station orbiting a dead moon, chosen specifically because no single species held territorial claim to it. Delegations from 6 different powers had gathered there to settle the boundaries of the contested frontier, before the fighting spread further than anyone could contain. I arrived 2 days before formal talks began, assigned to support the Krillian delegation as a junior analyst. My role limited mostly to reviewing background reports and briefing senior officials on other species' likely positions. I told myself this assignment had nothing to do with the name that still followed me through every quiet moment. I told myself I was here to do ordinary work, to fade into the background the way analysts were supposed to. I did not entirely believe it, but I repeated it to myself anyway as I walked the long corridor toward the delegation quarters, past representatives from species I had only ever seen in briefing files. The human delegation was smaller than most of the others, a handful of diplomats and advisors compared to the dozens each of the larger powers had brought. I noted this with mild surprise during my first briefing. A species with such a small formal presence seemed an unlikely source of the terror I had spent the past 2 weeks documenting. It reinforced, briefly, the comfortable theory that the name Harlan belonged to some rogue element operating outside official human command structures, unconnected to the polite diplomats now unpacking their materials in the quarters across from mine. That comfort lasted less than a day. I attended the opening reception that evening, a formal gathering meant to let delegations exchange pleasantries before the difficult negotiations began. I stood near the edge of the room, observing rather than participating, which was where analysts were generally expected to remain. The human delegation clustered near one of the refreshment tables, speaking in low, easy tones with a Dravith trade envoy who seemed genuinely charmed by their attempts at humor. At the back of their group stood a man who said almost nothing. He was introduced to me later, briefly, by one of the human diplomats, as an administrative advisor attached to logistics and security coordination. His name was given simply as Harlan, no surname offered, and I remember the way my stomach dropped when I heard it, though I kept my expression carefully neutral. It was, I told myself, a common enough human name. There was no reason to assume any connection between this quiet, unremarkable man refilling his cup at the refreshment table and the figure haunting the memories of dozens of traumatized soldiers 1,000 kilometers away. I studied him anyway, because studying people was my profession, and because something about him refused to let my attention move elsewhere. He was of ordinary height, exactly as several survivors had described, though others had described him as tall, which struck me now as strange, until I noticed the way he stood, a stillness in his posture, that made him seem to occupy more space than his actual size accounted for. He wore a simple gray uniform without insignia, nothing that marked him as anything more than administrative staff. His expression, as he listened to the conversation around him, was pleasant and mild, the face of someone content to let others speak while he observed. I approached, mostly out of professional habit, and introduced myself using my analyst designation rather than my full title. He shook my offered hand with an ordinary, unremarkable grip and offered a small, polite smile. "You're with the Krillian delegation," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am. I handle background analysis mostly." "That sounds like careful work," he said. "I imagine you notice things other people miss." There was nothing unusual in the comment, nothing that should have unsettled me, and yet something in the way he said it made me feel, for a brief moment, as though he already knew exactly what I had spent the last 2 weeks investigating. I dismissed the feeling as professional paranoia and asked him a series of ordinary questions about human logistics practices, the kind of small talk analysts use to gather background color for their reports. He answered each question directly and without hesitation, offering information freely, nothing evasive in his manner at all. And yet I noticed things while we spoke that I could not stop noticing afterward. I noticed that when a loud noise startled several delegates near the entrance, a dropped serving tray clattering against the floor, every human in the room glanced first toward Harlan before reacting themselves, as if checking his response before deciding on their own. I noticed that he did not glance toward the noise at all. He had already identified it before it happened, or so it seemed, his attention settling on the tray a fraction of a second before it hit the ground, as though he had heard it beginning to slip from the server's hands. I noticed that the other members of his delegation deferred to him constantly, in small, almost invisible ways. A diplomat checking his expression before answering a difficult question, a security officer adjusting his position near an exit whenever Harlan shifted his own stance, even slightly. None of it was formal. No one addressed him by any rank or title, and yet the deference was unmistakable to anyone trained to notice patterns of authority, which I was. I told myself this proved nothing. Every delegation had its quiet, respected figures, individuals whose experience earned informal authority, regardless of official rank. I continued my observations through the reception, gathering material for a report that grew stranger the longer I worked on it, until an incident near the end of the evening made it impossible for me to continue pretending this was simply background color. A delegate from a rival power, a species with a long-standing territorial dispute against several of the humans' allied worlds, had been drinking steadily throughout the reception, his temper visibly fraying as the evening progressed. Words were exchanged near the center of the room, low at first, then rising, until the delegate reached toward the concealed weapon every diplomat on this station was technically forbidden to carry. The room reacted the way rooms react to sudden danger, a ripple of alarm spreading outward from the center, security personnel beginning to move, other delegates stepping back instinctively. I felt my own body tense, preparing for an incident that could derail the entire negotiation before it formally began. Harlan moved before any of it fully registered. He did not rush. He did not shout a warning or draw any weapon of his own. He simply stepped forward, smoothly, positioning himself between the agitated delegate and the nearest cluster of unarmed diplomats, his posture calm, his hands visible and open at his sides. He said something quiet to the delegate, too low for me to hear from where I stood, and the delegate's hand, already halfway toward the concealed weapon, slowly stopped moving. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 4 seconds. To everyone else in the room, it likely looked like a minor tension diffused by a calm word at the right moment, the kind of small diplomatic skill any experienced advisor might possess. But I had spent 2 weeks studying exactly this kind of stillness, this exact quality of presence that made trained soldiers hesitate without understanding why. I had seen it described to me, imperfectly, dozens of times by people too frightened to find better words for it. I was still processing what I had just witnessed when a commotion at the entrance drew my attention away from Harlan entirely. A Krillian officer had entered the reception hall, a veteran attached to a different delegation, one I did not recognize personally. He stopped just inside the doorway, his gaze sweeping across the room in the automatic, cautious way soldiers scan unfamiliar spaces. His eyes reached the center of the room, where Harlan still stood near the now calmed delegate, and I watched the officer's entire posture change in an instant. His scales, visible along his exposed jawline, lost color rapidly, shifting from their normal deep green toward a pale, sickly gray. A physiological reaction our species experiences under extreme shock. He did not shout. He did not point or make any dramatic gesture that might have drawn wider attention. He simply stood frozen for a long moment, and then, so quietly that I almost missed it entirely, I heard him whisper the name. Harlan. It was not a greeting. It was not spoken the way one might address someone they recognize socially. It was spoken the way the young soldier in the refugee camp had spoken it, the way the medic Elira had spoken it, the way every survivor across 2 separate collapsed outposts had spoken it. A word carrying weight far beyond its simple sound, a word that meant something the officer's body understood before his mind had fully processed what he was looking at. Harlan turned toward him, and for the briefest moment, something shifted across his expression, something I could not fully name. Not cruelty. Not satisfaction. If anything, it looked closer to regret, a weariness that had nothing to do with the late hour or the demands of diplomatic small talk. He offered the officer a small, respectful nod, the kind one soldier might give another across a great and painful distance, and said nothing at all. The officer did not approach further. He remained near the entrance for the rest of the reception, watching Harlan from across the room with an expression I recognized instantly, because I had spent 2 weeks documenting it on dozens of other faces. It was not hatred. It was not even entirely fear, though fear was certainly part of it. It was something closer to reverence mixed with dread, the particular look of someone who had survived an encounter with something they still did not fully understand, and who had never expected to see it again standing calmly across a crowded diplomatic hall. I found myself unable to move for several seconds, my mind working rapidly to reconcile what I had just witnessed with everything I thought I knew. The unremarkable man who had been discussing trade logistics with me less than an hour earlier, the quiet advisor other humans deferred to without explanation, the calm figure who had diffused a potential incident in 4 seconds without raising his voice or reaching for a weapon. And now, undeniably, the same name that had haunted an entire refugee population, confirmed not by a document or a second-hand report, but by the direct, visceral reaction of a soldier who had clearly survived an encounter with him personally. I looked back toward Harlan, who had returned to his quiet conversation near the refreshment table, as though nothing unusual had happened at all, as though he had not just been recognized by name from across a crowded room by someone whose entire body had reacted with the kind of fear usually reserved for natural disasters or ancient predators. I realized, standing there in the middle of that reception hall, that I had spent 2 weeks searching for a monster, interviewing survivors, reviewing sensor footage, building profiles from fragments of trauma and rumor. And the entire time, if I had simply looked 3 feet to my left during an ordinary diplomatic reception, I would have found him standing beside me, discussing human logistics practices in a calm, pleasant voice, exactly as if he were nothing more than what his badge claimed him to be. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat in my quarters reviewing every detail of the evening, every small observation I had gathered, without understanding its significance, piecing together a picture that grew more unsettling the longer I studied it. Not because Harlan had done anything overtly threatening. He had not. Throughout the entire reception he had behaved with nothing but calm courtesy. That, I was beginning to understand, was precisely what made him so difficult to categorize using anything in the Assembly's military doctrine. Every framework I had been trained to use assumed that danger announced itself, that threat carried visible weight, that a person capable of ending a 3-day siege alone would carry himself with the obvious presence of a weapon. Harlan carried himself like an accountant discussing quarterly logistics reports. I understood, finally, sitting alone in the dim light of my quarters, that I could no longer approach this as a distant intelligence problem, something to be solved through interviews and sensor footage and carefully worded reports submitted up a chain of command that did not want to hear the answer. Whatever this man was, whatever had happened on those 2 fallen outposts, I was going to have to ask him myself, directly, and find out if I could survive whatever answer he chose to give me. I found him the following morning, alone on an observation deck overlooking the dead moon the station orbited, standing with a cup of tea in his hands and no visible security detail nearby, as though he had simply decided he did not need one. The formal negotiations were not scheduled to resume for another hour, and the corridor outside was quiet enough that our conversation would remain private. He glanced toward me as I approached, and something in his expression told me he had been expecting this conversation, perhaps since the moment the officer had whispered his name across the reception hall the night before. "You have questions," he said, before I had spoken a single word. "I do." I kept my voice level. though my hands were not entirely steady at my sides. I have spent 2 weeks investigating reports of a man responsible for the collapse of at least 2 Krillian defensive positions along the frontier. Survivors describe someone who cannot be stopped through conventional means. They speak your name the way one might speak of a natural disaster. That sounds like an exaggeration, he said, not unkindly. Is it? He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands, his gaze drifting toward the dead moon outside the viewport. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier lightness. I was not sent to those outposts to destroy anything, he said. I was there because civilians were still inside the perimeter when the defensive lines began to fail, and there was no time to organize a formal evacuation through proper channels. Someone had to hold a corridor open long enough for them to get out. Alone. Not by choice. The soldiers assigned to that section had already fallen back, and I could not blame them for it. The position was not holding. Continuing to defend it in the conventional sense would have meant abandoning the civilians still trying to reach the extraction point. So you continued when everyone else had already decided the position was lost. I suppose that's one way to describe it, he said. I've never found the doctrine that says a fight is over just because the people fighting it agree that it is. Sometimes it's over. Sometimes it isn't, and the only way to find out is to keep going a little longer than seems reasonable. I studied him carefully as he spoke, searching for any sign of the boastfulness I might have expected from someone recounting an event that had left an entire refugee population whispering his name in fear. I found none. If anything, he seemed almost uncomfortable discussing it, the way someone might discuss a difficult decision they still were not entirely certain had been the right one. The soldiers who survived that engagement, I said, described something they could not explain through conventional combat effectiveness. Weapons fire that did not stop you, a presence that broke discipline in trained units simply by continuing to move forward. That is not simply holding a corridor open for civilians, that is something else. He set his cup down on the railing beside him and turned to face me fully for the first time since I had arrived. I think what they saw, he said slowly, was someone who had already decided the outcome before the fighting reached its conclusion. That decision doesn't come from armor or weapons or training, though all of those things helped keep me alive long enough for it to matter. It comes from somewhere else. I'm not sure I can explain it in a way that will make sense within whatever framework your assembly uses to evaluate combat effectiveness. Try, I said. He considered the request for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried none of the drama the situation seemed to demand. It was quiet, almost conversational, as though we were still discussing trade logistics rather than the event that had shattered the confidence of an entire border region. Most military doctrines I've studied, yours included, calculate the cost of a fight before deciding whether to continue it, he said. At some threshold of losses, of resource depletion, of tactical disadvantage, the calculation flips, and continuing stops being rational. That threshold exists for good reason. It keeps armies from destroying themselves over positions that were never worth holding in the first place. And you don't use that calculation. I use it constantly, in most situations, he said. But that day, the calculation wasn't about tactical advantage. It was about how many more minutes the civilians behind me needed to reach safety. As long as the answer to that question was more than 0, the fight wasn't over, regardless of what the tactical situation said about it. That is not a strategy, I said. That is refusing to accept that a battle is lost. Maybe, he said. Or maybe it's understanding that the people making that calculation for me weren't the ones who had to live with what happened if I stopped too early. I did not have an immediate response to that. I had spent 2 weeks building a psychological profile designed to explain an anomaly, a break in the predictable patterns of warfare that every species in this region relied on to understand and manage conflict. I had expected, somewhere beneath the professional distance I maintained, to find either a monster or an exceptional weapon, something that could be studied, categorized, and eventually accounted for within existing doctrine. Instead, I found a tired man on an observation deck, drinking tea and speaking quietly about a decision he still seemed uncertain had been worth its cost, who did not consider what he had done particularly remarkable at all. The soldiers who survived that day still whisper your name, I said. Grown warriors, hardened by years of frontier service, go pale at the mere mention of it. Whatever you believe about your own actions, the effect on them was real, and it was significant. He was quiet for a while before answering, his gaze returning to the dead moon outside the viewport. I think that's the part people struggle with the most, he said finally. It wasn't that I was especially strong, or especially skilled, though training certainly helped. It's that I kept coming, past the point where every rule they'd been taught said a person should stop. Most doctrines depend on an assumption that everyone eventually reaches a breaking point where continuing no longer makes sense. When someone doesn't reach that point, or refuses to acknowledge it even when they probably should, it breaks something in the people around them that has nothing to do with physical strength at all. You are describing a weakness in how militaries calculate risk, I said slowly, beginning to understand the shape of what he meant. Not a weakness in the enemy's weapons or numbers, but in the assumption that every combatant eventually accepts when a position is truly lost. That's part of it, he said. But I think there's something else too. Something about my species specifically, though I hesitate to speak for all of humanity, based on my own experience alone. We don't always calculate the cost of a fight before deciding whether to have it. Sometimes we calculate it afterward, if at all. I understand that sounds reckless. In many ways, it is reckless. It has gotten a great many of us killed over the course of our history, in conflicts we probably should have avoided or ended much sooner than we did. Then why is it something to be feared, rather than pitied as a flaw? He looked at me directly then, and for a moment I saw something in his expression that none of the survivor testimonies had captured, something quieter and more complicated than the terror etched into their memories. Because sometimes, he said, that same flaw is the only thing standing between the people you care about and a fate that every rational calculation says is already decided. I'm not proud of what happened at that outpost. I'm not ashamed of it either. I did what needed doing until there was nothing left that needed doing, and then I stopped, because by then the reason to keep going was gone. I stood there on that observation deck for a long while after he finished speaking, turning his words over in my mind, trying to reconcile them with everything I had gathered over the past 2 weeks. The sensor footage of a figure walking calmly through weapons fire, the medic's account of soldiers who simply stopped fighting, not from exhaustion, but from something closer to disbelief, the veteran officer's face draining of color at the mere sound of a name spoken across a crowded room. None of it had come from cruelty, none of it had come from overwhelming, obvious power. It had come from something far harder to defend against, something no weapon or shield could counter, because it did not live in the body at all. It lived in a decision, made and remade in every moment of that engagement, to continue regardless of what the surrounding chaos suggested was rational. There's something you should understand, Harlan said quietly, as I turned to leave. What happened at that outpost wasn't a victory I set out to achieve. It was the last option left once every other one had already failed. I would trade the fear those soldiers still carry for a version of that day where none of it had been necessary at all, if such a trade were possible. It isn't. So I carry it, the same way they do, even if I carry it differently. I left the observation deck with far more questions than I had arrived with, though not the kind of questions I had expected. I no longer wondered whether Harlan was dangerous. That question had been answered clearly enough by the evidence I had already gathered. What I wondered now was something the Assembly's doctrine had no framework for evaluating at all, something I would need to find my own words to describe if I ever hoped to explain it to anyone else. I wondered what it meant that the most dangerous thing about an entire species might not be found in their weapons, their numbers, or their strategy, but in something far simpler and far harder to counter. A willingness to keep going long after every reasonable calculation said they should have already stopped. I returned to my quarters that afternoon carrying a weight I had not expected when I first boarded the transport to this station. The negotiations continued around me for the remainder of the week, delegates arguing over territorial boundaries and resource rights, human representatives making concessions with the same easy, cooperative manner that had convinced the Assembly they were harmless. I sat through those sessions taking notes I barely absorbed, my thoughts circling back again and again to the quiet man on the observation deck, and to the report I now had to write. Commander Athos contacted me on the final evening of the summit, requesting a preliminary summary of my findings before formal negotiations concluded the following morning. I sat alone in my quarters for a long time before opening a new document, uncertain how to begin something that needed to explain what I had learned without collapsing it into either exaggeration or dismissal. The easy path was in front of me. I could write the report the Assembly expected, the one that would confirm every comfortable assumption already held about humanity. I could frame Harlan as an isolated anomaly, a single soldier whose actions, while notable, revealed nothing meaningful about the species as a whole. That report would be believed without argument. It would be filed, reviewed, and eventually forgotten, exactly the way Athos had predicted when he first waved away my concerns as the product of frightened refugees constructing coherent narratives out of chaos. I did not write that report. Instead, I began with the sensor footage, describing exactly what I had seen without embellishment, a figure walking at an ordinary pace through weapons fire that should have ended him within seconds. I included the testimony from Alira, the medic who had described soldiers stopping mid-engagement not from exhaustion but from something closer to disbelief. I included Corin's account, the young engineer who had watched trained marksmen fire directly at Harlan from close range and had never found a way to explain what he witnessed afterward. I described the reception hall, the veteran officer whose scales had drained of color at the mere sound of a whispered name, the 4 seconds it had taken Harlan to defuse a potential incident without raising his voice or reaching for a weapon. I described the deference other humans showed him, quiet and informal, carrying none of the rigid hierarchy our own military culture relied upon, and yet unmistakable to anyone trained to recognize authority in its many forms. Then I moved to the conversation itself, the one that had changed how I understood everything I had gathered before it. I wrote that Harlan had not described himself as exceptional. I wrote that he had framed his actions at the outpost not as a demonstration of strength, but as the only remaining option once every other option had already failed. I wrote as carefully as I could manage his explanation of the calculation most militaries relied upon, the threshold at which continuing a fight stopped being rational, and his admission that he did not always operate according to that threshold, not because he was unaware of it, but because in that moment, a different calculation had mattered more to him. I paused for a long time before writing the section I knew would be the most difficult for the assembly to accept, the conclusion I had reached sitting alone on that observation deck after he finished speaking. The danger humanity represented, I wrote, was not found in superior weapons or overwhelming numbers, both of which our analysts had already confirmed were unremarkable compared to established powers in this region. It was not found in advanced technology or specialized training, though their soldiers were certainly capable. It was found in something far more difficult to counter through conventional military doctrine, something that did not appear on any equipment manifest or unit roster. Every species I had studied across my career calculated the cost of a conflict before deciding whether to engage in it. That calculation was not a weakness. It was the foundation of rational warfare, the mechanism that prevented armies from destroying themselves over positions not worth holding, that allowed commanders to know, with reasonable confidence, when continuing a fight had stopped making sense. Our entire military culture, and the culture of every allied and rival power I had ever studied, was built upon the assumption that this calculation existed universally, that every combatant, given enough pressure, would eventually recognize the moment a position became untenable and respond accordingly. Humanity, based on everything I had gathered, did not always make that calculation in advance. Sometimes, according to Harlan's own account, they made it afterward. If they made it at all, that was not, as I might once have assumed, evidence of poor training or inferior strategic thinking. It was something else entirely, a trait woven so deeply into how at least some of them approached conflict that it broke the predictive models every other species relied upon to understand and manage warfare. An army that calculates the cost of a fight before choosing whether to have it can be deterred. Its behavior can be predicted, planned around, countered through demonstrations of overwhelming force that make continuing the fight clearly irrational. An army, or in this case a single individual, that sometimes ignores that calculation entirely, cannot be deterred through the same methods, because the frameworks used to communicate deterrence rely on an audience capable of receiving that message and acting on it in the expected way. I finished the report as the station's artificial night cycle deepened outside my viewport, and I sat with it for a long while before submitting it through the proper channels. I understood, even as I sent it, that it would not be received the way I hoped. Commander Athis and the officers above him had built their understanding of humanity around comfortable, familiar categories, and my report asked them to discard those categories entirely, in favor of something far less comfortable to plan around. I was not wrong to expect that reaction. Within 2 days, I received a formal response acknowledging my findings, while quietly recommending that further analysis be conducted before any changes were made to existing threat assessments regarding human military capability. The word unpredictable appeared twice in the response. The word reckless appeared 3 times. Nowhere in the reply did I find any indication that the deeper implication of my report had been understood at all. I thought about that response for a long time afterward, turning it over the way I had turned over Harlan's words on the observation deck. I thought about how easily unpredictable became a synonym for reckless in the minds of officers who had spent their careers learning to read and counter rational threats, and how dangerous that mistake might prove to be if it ever needed correcting under conditions far less forgiving than a diplomatic summit. I thought too about the young Dravith soldier in the refugee camp, still holding a cup of water he could not bring himself to drink, whispering a single name because it was the only word large enough to hold what he had witnessed. I thought about Alira, calmly describing triage decisions until the moment the name came up, and about Corin, still replaying a memory he no longer entirely trusted, searching for an explanation that fit inside the world he thought he understood. None of them had been wrong to be afraid. I understood that now in a way I had not when I first arrived in that camp, skeptical and mildly amused by what I assumed was exaggerated rumor. Their fear was not a failure of understanding. It was, if anything, the most accurate assessment anyone had produced so far. More accurate than any formal intelligence report the Assembly had generated, including my own. I requested a final meeting with Harlan before the summit concluded, and my transport departed the station. I found him near the same observation deck, though this time he was not alone. A young human diplomat sat beside him, laughing quietly at something he had said, and I watched them for a moment before approaching, struck again by how ordinary he appeared, how easily he moved through conversation and small moments of warmth, nothing in his manner suggesting the weight I now knew he carried. He noticed me and excused himself politely from the conversation, meeting me a short distance away near the viewport. "You submitted your report," he said. It was not a question. I did. I wrote what I found, as accurately as I could. "And how was it received?" "Poorly," I admitted. "They believe I am overstating an isolated incident. They will continue planning around the assumption that your people are unlikely to pose a serious military threat, because that assumption is easier to work with than the alternative." He was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Does that trouble you?" "It does," I said, "because I no longer believe it is true, and I do not think the difference between believing it and not believing it will matter until the moment it matters most, at which point it will already be too late to correct." He nodded slowly, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, into something that might have been gratitude, or might simply have been recognition that at least one person outside his own delegation had understood what he had tried, imperfectly, to explain. "For what it's worth," he said, "I hope your commander is right, and I hope you never have to find out how accurate your report actually was. I would rather this be the last time anyone whispers that name in fear because of something I had to do." I thought about that statement often in the days that followed, as I boarded my transport home and watched the diplomatic station shrink behind me into the darkness of open space. I thought about the strange, quiet weariness in his voice when he said it, so different from the terror that word inspired in everyone else who spoke it. I finished my formal assessment for the assembly that week, submitting it exactly as I had drafted it on the station, unwilling to soften its conclusions simply because they were unwelcome. I understood, even as I filed it, that it would likely change very little in how the assembly planned for future conflict along the frontier. Doctrines built over centuries do not shift easily because of a single analyst's report, however carefully researched. But I kept a copy of my own, along with my private notes from every interview I had conducted, every frame of sensor footage I had reviewed, every quiet word Harlan had spoken to me on that observation deck. I kept them because I believed, whether or not the assembly chose to listen, that someone should remember accurately what had happened at those outposts, and why an entire population of hardened soldiers had learned to whisper a single name in fear. Not because he was a monster, not because he wielded some weapon beyond our understanding, but because he represented something far harder to counter than either of those things. A species capable of ignoring the very calculation every other power in this region relied upon to keep warfare predictable, manageable, survivable, within the comfortable boundaries everyone had agreed to respect. I closed my final report with a single line, one I was not certain anyone above me would fully understand, though I hoped, someday, someone eventually would. They believed they had documented a threat. What they had actually documented, without realizing it, was the end of their certainty, and no army I had ever studied had found a reliable way to defend against that.